Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Stephen Kellen lecture entitled Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy, which will be delivered tonight by Ambassador Martin Indyk. First, a word about the man for whom the lecture is named. For those of you who don't know the Academy, it's safe to say that Stephen Kellen is one of a small handful of people without whom we would not be here. The husband of Anna Maria Arnold Kellen, who grew up in this house, Stephen Kellen had to flee the city with his wife because of his German ancestry in the 1930s. In New York, he rebuilt the Arnold Family Bank from the ground up into a thriving financial enterprise, and he was an extraordinarily far-sighted individual who soon after the war was instrumental in the revival of German industry. He was a man of wide-ranging interests and deep culture and a devotion to the city of Berlin, so that many years later, when Ambassador Richard Holbrooke presented the idea of the American Academy to him and Anna Maria, he seized upon it. Today, we remain deeply indebted to Stephen Kellen as he, along with his wife Anna Maria, provided the founding gift for the renovation of the villa that would become the American Academy. The Hans Arnold Center, the house in which we are seated or standing tonight, is named after Stephen Kellen's father-in-law, and we are truly grateful to the Kellen-Arnold family, which continues to be enormously generous in its support of the Academy and deeply engaged with the institution. So our speaker tonight, as I mentioned, is Ambassador Martin Indyk, whose accomplishments are numerous, but one that stands out here and has to be acknowledged first is his marriage to Gail Hodges Burt. Gail is a founding member of the board of the Academy, as well as its longtime board chairman. Since its creation, as in a Renaissance painting, Gail has been one of the angels hovering over the Hans Arnold Center, protecting us, defending us, and bringing us all forms of sustenance. And when she isn't playing that role with remarkable grace, she has been more mundanely occupying the desk where my clutter is now spread out and keeping the place going. And the Academy owes more to Gail than it can either measure or repay, and it is really wonderful to have you here tonight. So I first met Martin Indyk in October of 1994 at the White House. I was young, I had dark hair, and just a few weeks earlier I had started work as a speechwriter for President Clinton. Martin was also dark-haired in those days, but he seemed to me to be somehow far, far advanced, a towering and even awesome figure, like several of the other senior people I met in those days. And the reason we were meeting was that President Clinton was soon to embark upon a trip in the Middle East where he would sign a historic peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. He would also speak to several parliaments and conduct some very important diplomacy. And honestly, it was a thrill to be involved in an event that was, in my view, a high watermark of American diplomacy in the Middle East. And being a presidential speechwriter is about the best graduate education you can get in American government. I was plunged into myriad subjects and instructed by the very best in the business, and it was clear to me then that Martin was certainly one of the very best in the business. And I learned from him in those years more than I can say. He was a perfectionist's perfectionist. As U.S. ambassador in Israel, he would accompany the Israeli prime minister on his visit to Washington for the annual gala of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And without fail, Martin would call me on the morning, always a Sunday, when the president was going to speak, and cheerfully explain to me why the speech I had so carefully crafted had to be rewritten. "Hello, Dan," he would say in that Australian accent that I can't really imitate. "It's your nemesis." My then girlfriend, current wife, was always astonished by this annual event. Anyway, Martin had a dazzling career in government. He was senior director for Near East, South Asia, at the White House, two-time ambassador to Israel. Has there ever been another two-time ambassador to Israel? No. Of course, if we were going to have a two-time ambassador to Israel from the United States, he would be an Australian. Assistant Secretary of State for Near East. I was very fortunate to work with Martin on in a number of different capacities, including later at the Brookings Institution, where he ran the center devoted to the Middle East. I ran the one dedicated to the United States and Europe. And even though I later also had the privilege of having a senior State Department position, Martin still seemed to me larger than life, as he does today. He has written a truly remarkable book. This book, which I read on this iPad, because I couldn't wait to get the copy of this book into my hands. And if I had read this book in this form, it would be filled with little yellow Post-its, because that's what I do when I'm going to have to someday talk about a book. And because it's in here, I have found that I have on every page, virtually every page, one of those little blue bookmarks in the Kindle edition, which is completely useless. So students, if you're watching this, don't do that. Anyway, it is an extraordinary book. And the account of Henry Kissinger's experiences as he presided over one of the two most fruitful periods of U.S. diplomacy, written by the person who presided over the other one, I think is a unique historical achievement. The narrative is enthralling. The characters are worthy of a great novel. It is minutely detailed. I mean, minutely, too. I mean, the china in the Benjamin Franklin room at the State Department, it's all in there, and it all adds up. It all adds to a great narrative. In addition to being a really remarkable manual on diplomatic practice, it's also a terrific guide to the Middle East, with many observations on the customs, expectations, and pitfalls of the political culture of the countries in the region, because Martin is moving back and forth from his own experiences to Kissinger's, and the Enlightenment is really tremendous. I can't recommend it enough. So, Martin, I'm about to hand over the microphone to you. But in the age of Zoom, I still have to give a little preview of what's ahead. Martin will deliver his talk. At any time, those of you who are in our Zoom audience, please start filling up the Q&A queue with questions. You don't have to wait. Martin and I will have a short conversation. I know that the questions from our distinguished guests here and those watching will be even more interesting, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. And right now, Martin, the podium is yours.
Could I get some water up here, please? Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back at the American Academy. I first appeared here as a visiting fellow, not distinguished in those days like I am today. But I was speaking about the Middle East. I think it was just after I left government the first time, at the end of the Clinton administration. And then Gail and I came back when we had married. At the first time I was here, I didn't even know Gail. And the second time we came back for a summer, and as some of you may know, those of you who are resident here, the Academy is closed during the summer, but because I was married to the chairman, had special privileges, we got to stay here. And I got to start writing this book, 2016, the summer of 2016, in that magnificent studio complex down by the lake. And so the origins of this book is the American Academy in Berlin, and it's wonderful now to come full circle and to have the opportunity to talk about it. I'm deeply honoured to be the Stephen Kellen Distinguished Visiting Fellow. I didn't have the opportunity to meet Stephen, but I do remember meeting his wife, then widow, Anna Maria, who I remember grilled me to establish whether I was suitable enough to marry Gail, who she had a special affection for. But I'm very familiar with the rest of the Arnold Kellen family, and just repeat what Daniel has said about the incredible role they've played in supporting the Academy. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to represent the family, as it were, in this way. This book was something that I first conceived when I finished my second time in government as President Obama's special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That was in 2013 and 2014, and it ended, like my first time in government, in a fairly spectacular failure of the effort to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And rather than write another book about that failure, I wrote my first book about our first efforts in the Clinton administration. I decided that I would try to do something else. The question that animated me in those days was essentially what went wrong, or what were we doing wrong. There was enough blame to go around in terms of blaming the two sides, and Bibi Netanyahu and Abu Mazen, the Palestinian leader, certainly deserved a lot of the blame. But I had come to the conclusion that it wasn't enough, that there was something fundamentally wrong with the practice of American diplomacy when it came to the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. And so, therefore, I decided to go back to the beginning, where it all began, with the diplomacy of Henry Kissinger after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when he embarked as Secretary of State on an effort to promote an American-led peace process in the region. And he was, unlike us, amazingly successful at it. Brokered two agreements between Israel and Egypt, one between Israel and Syria, which, as I say, laid the foundations for the American-led peace process that essentially ended back in 2014 on my watch. There hasn't been an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation since then. You can believe it. 8 years now. There hasn't been an Israeli-Palestinian agreement since 1998, when we brokered the Y agreement between Yasser Arafat and Bibi Netanyahu, believe it or not. So Kissinger's achievements were quite significant at the time and essential to the peace treaty that took place 2 years after he left office, negotiated by Jimmy Carter, but on the basis of the foundations that Kissinger had laid with his Israel-Egypt agreements. And so that's why I decided to go back and look at what we could learn from Kissinger's diplomacy. I benefited greatly from the fact that Kissinger is a man of history and a student of history, and therefore documented every conversation he had, including those with his celebrity girlfriends, Liza Minnelli and Elizabeth Taylor and so on. Just as a footnote here, Gail Burt was his secretary in those days and was transcribing these conversations. But they're all there in the various archives, presidential archives, and Kissinger's own papers. 95% of his conversations and negotiations have been declassified. So it's a real treasure trove of documentation, the likes of which I guess, and there are many diplomats in the audience that can attest to this, simply doesn't exist today. The documents tend, either it doesn't get written down on paper or somehow the paper disappears. So I suspect that what I was able to do is something that is a thing of the past. But it was all there in details which I'm not sure that Henry himself expected would be subjected to such close scrutiny. Secondly, I had access to Kissinger himself, and he was very generous with his time, and I interviewed him 12 times formally and many other conversations. And then I tried, as Daniel mentioned, to illuminate the story that I tell there with my own experiences, in many ways on the same diplomatic high roads, dealing with Yitzhak Rabin and Hafez al-Assad and King Hussein, who were three of the main actors in the story that I tell. Anwar Sadat was the really big player, and I didn't have a chance to meet him. So that is how I wrote this book. What I discovered along the way was a surprise to me. And Kissinger was not a stranger to me. I'd actually written my doctoral dissertation about the role of the United States in making peace in the Middle East. And so I'd studied his role, particularly in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But once I started to delve into the archives, I discovered something quite strange. When Anwar Sadat or Yitzhak Rabin or even Hafez al-Assad, then the president of Syria, would tell Kissinger that they were ready to take the big step to make peace, that their people were ready for peace, Kissinger would always back them off and say, no, you don't want to go there. That's too ambitious. That's too far. That's not worth the paper it's written on. The natural state of affairs between states, Kissinger, the realist, would tell them, is one of conflict. And our role is to ameliorate the conflict, not to end it. And as I say, I set out to write a book about how to make peace and how not to make peace in the Middle East. And I discover that Henry Kissinger is actually not that much in favour of peacemaking. And that led me on a new course of inquiry to try to understand the origins of his own thinking about this, the intellectual origins of his thinking about peace. And this turns out to be a German story, in the sense that, of course, Kissinger is a German refugee from Nazism, fled to the United States with his family. 13 of his closest family were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Yet his intellectual development is greatly informed by German thinkers and German experience. And I, as I went back and looked at what he had written, I started with his first book, which was his doctoral dissertation. And some of you may be familiar with it. It's definitely worth reading. It's called A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh, and the Problems of Peace. And there it was in the title, The Problems of Peace. And indeed, on the first page, he he talks about what he found in his study of Metternich and Castlereagh with the problems of peace, or the paradox of peace, as he calls it, which was that statesmen, world leaders, are often prone to pursue peace with too much enthusiasm and too much idealism. And as a consequence of that pursuit, the paradox is that they achieve the opposite, that is to say, war. Of course, Kissinger's own experience was informed by the Treaty of Versailles and the history of what happened with that attempt to make the peace to end all peace, and then the appeasement of the second that led up to the Second World War, and it's that experience that I think informed his study that appears in this book of the order that Metternich and Castlereagh created in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. This massive disruption, destructive disruption of life in Europe was followed by an order that lasted more or less for 100 years until it broke down in the First World War. Now, of course, there were conflicts during that time, but essentially the peace was maintained in the sense that the conflict was ameliorated and the order was maintained by an arrangement between the great powers, the five great powers. And that is the model of order which has animated Kissinger's approach to international affairs ever since. It was order that he sought in his own life to deal with the chaos that he had grown up with in Germany, and it was order that he sought to create in international affairs. And so that is essentially the way that he approached the Middle East when he came to deal with it. At first, Kissinger was excluded from dealing with the Middle East. Nixon, his president, told him they would work together on the big issues. They talked with the Soviet Union, the breakthrough to China, ending the Vietnam War, etc. But the Middle East was to be the domain of the State Department under Secretary of State William Rogers. And the reason that Nixon explicitly excluded Kissinger from this was because Kissinger was Jewish. And for Nixon, he considered that, with a kind of anti-Semitic attitude on his part, he considered Kissinger prone to dual loyalty and therefore could not be relied upon to deal with the Middle East. Nothing could be more objectionable to Kissinger than to be excluded from some part of foreign policy. And so he spent 3 years in a battle royal with William Rogers, which he finally won. And Nixon, out of exasperation, said, all right, you do it. And when Kissinger essentially took the reins in 1972, his approach was this kind of classic Kissingerian realpolitik approach of maintaining a balance of power in favour of the stabilising status quo powers in the region. So he supported the arming of Israel so that it could maintain a deterrent balance against its Arab neighbours so that they would not go to war. And he, you'll recall, supported the Shah of Iran with a similar largesse, providing the Shah with weapons to maintain peace and stability in the Persian Gulf. And he bolstered that with the détente with the Soviet Union, in which the superpowers explicitly and publicly agreed that neither would take unilateral advantage of the situation in the Middle East, and therefore they would work together to maintain stability there. And he thought that that was enough to maintain order in a volatile part of the world. When the 1973 war broke out, he was taken completely by surprise, as were the Israelis. And that was partly because he relied on Israeli assessments, and they kept on telling him, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. But it was also because he did not take Sadat seriously. He called him a buffoon. He said that, from his point of view, he was like some character out of the opera Aida. And so much so that when Sadat evicted the Soviet advisors, some 20,000 of them, from Egypt in 1972, July 1972, which Kissinger had 2 years earlier called on the Arabs to do, is to get rid of their dependence on the Soviet Union, he did not respond. Instead, when Sadat tried, almost immediately after evicting the Soviet advisors, to reach out to Kissinger, he delayed and delayed and delayed. But in February of 1973, he had a secret meeting in just outside of New York City, secret because he was keeping it secret from the State Department, not from anybody else. He had this secret meeting with Sadat's National Security Advisor, Hafez Ismail. And the protocols have since come out, and it's very clear that Sadat sent Hafez Ismail to Kissinger with a far-reaching peace initiative, which Kissinger at the time was quite excited by. Reported to Nixon, Nixon was quite excited by it. And yet, when Kissinger sat down with the then Israeli ambassador, a guy named Yitzhak Rabin, and told him about this apparently exciting peace initiative, Rabin just dismissed it completely. Said, there's nothing there, there's nothing new, nothing to do. And then when Rabin's boss, Golda Meir, came to town within a few days, she said the same thing to Nixon. Forget about it, there's nothing to be done. And Kissinger forgot about it. Had he pursued it, it's possible that the Yom Kippur War could have been headed off. But he was so wedded to the idea that the balance of power was all that was needed to maintain order that he didn't. When the war broke out, on the other hand, he saw a plastic moment to create a more stable order, and he seized upon it. I won't go into the details, but it's a fascinating story of how he engaged in crisis management to produce an outcome which would enable the United States to play the role of the mediator between Israel and the Arabs in order to promote a peace process. Not peace, but a peace process. And he did this because he recognized in the midst of this war that there was something missing from his structure of order. And that was the need for a legitimizing mechanism, which he talks about in A World Restored, which the great powers had back in 19th century Europe. And the legitimizing mechanism in this case was a peace process that would give the Arabs a sense, a modicum of justice, a sense that they could achieve the redress of their grievances through a process that would lead them to regain territory from Israel that Israel had occupied in the previous war in 1967. And that's what he had in mind. Not the pursuit of an end of conflict, end of claims, peace agreement, but rather something less ambitious, something more conservative, something that could be incremental. He called it step-by-step diplomacy, in which through a series of agreements, Israel would agree to make territorial withdrawals, smaller ones rather than the full withdrawal to the 67 lines, and in return would get security arrangements that, with the Arabs, that would make it difficult for them to go back to war. The amelioration of conflict, not the end of conflict. And that was his approach. His view of peace was also informed by a great German thinker, Immanuel Kant. It's not that Kissinger thought that peace was impossible. He just bought onto this idea, this Kantian idea, that peace would come eventually after the powers exhausted themselves and had enough of conflict, they would eventually turn to make peace. And that was his idea in terms of the Arab-Israeli peace process that he introduced, that it was a trade of territory that Israel would give up for time to exhaust the Arabs so that they would eventually come to terms with Israel, be willing to reconcile with it and normalize their relations with it. And at that point, time would have been sufficient for Israel to reduce its isolation, with American support strengthen itself, so that when the Arabs were finally ready for an end of conflict agreement, Israel would be ready to give up the territory more or less to the 1967 lines. And that was his view of the way in which the peace process could eventually achieve peace. But he never believed that it would be on his watch. This was something that would take decades. And indeed, that's how it evolved. Territory for time eventually exhausted the Arabs. And the normalization that's taken place in the Abraham Accords occurred on Kissinger's timetable. And what did the Emirati Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed say when he justified finally normalizing relations with Israel? He said, "We're tired of this conflict." And so, that was one side of it. The other side of it was not exactly what Kissinger had expected. Yes, he convinced Israel, and I describe in some detail the knockdown, drag-out fight he had with Golda Meir in the first instance to convince her to yield territory. But he convinced them of this idea of territory for time. And he so convinced them that it became a foundational basis for Israel's negotiating strategy with the Arabs. And so Israel gave up territory in the Sinai under Kissinger's aegis. Then it gave up all of the Sinai for peace with Egypt, but it was a separate peace which enabled Israel to hold on to the West Bank. And similarly, we can go through it in terms of the various concessions they made. But, Ariel Sharon, you remember, gave up Gaza, withdrew from Gaza, took out all the settlements from Gaza. The better to hold on to the West Bank. And territory for time, ironically, was used by the Israelis not to give up the West Bank, but to tighten their grip on the West Bank. When Kissinger left office, there were 1,600 settlers in the West Bank. There are now 460,000 settlers in the West Bank in 131 settlements, to the point where it becomes almost inconceivable to imagine that the Israelis could actually yield the West Bank to a Palestinian state. But that was long beyond Kissinger's time. And what Kissinger had envisaged. In my last interview with Kissinger, asked him whether he ever regretted not making the peace between Israel and Egypt that Jimmy Carter negotiated 2 years after Kissinger left office. And he said to me, no. He said, I was very glad it happened. But had I become Secretary of State in a second Ford administration, then I would have pursued something less than a peace treaty, another tranche of withdrawal by Israel in return for non-belligerency, something short of peace. And he said the reason was that I always feared that if I pushed it too hard, I would break it. For me, that was a light bulb moment, because that's exactly what we did at Camp David in 2000, under pressure from Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel. We abandoned the Oslo process, which, by the way, was a step-by-step incremental process that Rabin had introduced to deal with the Palestinian conflict, that he had borrowed from his time dealing with Kissinger. Even though he'd opposed it at the time, he reintroduced it in Oslo, which was a three-phase process of withdrawal with the ultimate outcome postponed. Nothing in Oslo about a Palestinian state, about Jerusalem, about refugees. But Barak came along and insisted that we abandon this step-by-step process and go for a final agreement with the Palestinians. And Clinton, in his last year in office, wanting to achieve a peace agreement, pursuing peace with too much enthusiasm, Kissinger would have said, decided to go for it. And we dragged Yasser Arafat there. He did not want to go. He was not ready to end the conflict and end the claims. And as a result of that effort, notwithstanding a generous offer from Ehud Barak, it nevertheless could not meet Palestinian requirements for an end of conflict, end of claims agreement. And it ended in failure, but not just failure, it ended with the whole eruption of the Palestinian Intifada and the eruption again of a violent storm that consumed the lives of thousands of Israelis and Palestinians and consumed the edifice of peace that we'd worked so hard for 8 years to create, and in the process consumed all trust between Israelis and Palestinians, to the point where it's like Humpty Dumpty. 4 American presidents have tried, not knowing Kissinger, tried to pursue end-of-conflict agreements, and 4 presidents have failed to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so that is the ultimate lesson I derived from this effort to understand Henry Kissinger's diplomacy. It is that it can often be a mistake to try to reach for end-of-conflict agreements. That constitutes more often than not an overreaching. Kissinger himself underreached back in February of 1972, but also again, as I detail in the book, when he had the opportunity to do an agreement between Israel and Jordan that would have put Jordan back into the West Bank in 1974. And I document the opportunity that existed, the willingness of the Jordanians and Israelis to engage in this, and Kissinger's unwillingness to get involved at all, which was a case of underreaching, which he recognises in retrospect as being a mistake that could have changed the course of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiating history had a Jordanian anchor been present there. So that is the end of the lesson, if you like, that peace can often be achieved more effectively in incremental steps than in an effort to jump to a final agreement that the parties are not yet ready to make the compromises necessary for it to be achieved. Thank you very much.
One thing that really distinguishes what Kissinger was trying to do from what you and the Clinton administration and subsequent administrations were trying to do is that Kissinger is playing at least two games at once. And the other one is fascinating, and that is getting the Soviets out of the Middle East and creating the basis for Pax America in the region. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that figures into his calculations. Yes, he's got détente, but he is eager to undermine their global position whenever it is possible. And sometimes, reading the book, I wondered which was more important to him. I mean, yes, he's clearly, well, I'll ask you about his feelings about Israel in a second, but he's clearly deeply engaged in this effort, and he really wants to safeguard Israel and have a stable order in the region. But part of that stable order also depends on getting the U.S. on top and the Russians out.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it perhaps has some applicability to the challenge that we're all dealing with today of how to deal with Vladimir Putin's Russia. Kissinger, as I said, had agreed with the Soviet Union that they would not take advantage of the situation in the Middle East for unilateral gain. And yet, he had in mind, from the outset of his time in government, that he would find a way to get the Soviet Union out of the Middle East. Soviet Union in those days, when Kissinger came into office, had positions of influence, treaties of friendship with all of the main Arab powers, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. And so it really had a kind of dominant position in the Arab world. The United States didn't even have diplomatic relations with Egypt and Syria in those days. And we know that he intended to find a way to screw the Soviet Union in the Middle East because he said it publicly in his first ever press conference when he called on the Arabs to remove the Soviets. And so he had this kind of dual approach. It wasn't an ambivalence. He played them. On the one hand, he cooperated with them as the requirements of détente. On the other hand, he was out to push them out of the Middle East. But his calculation was that he had to show the Arabs that through war, through dependence on the Soviet Union and Soviet arms and the pursuit of the conflict, they would achieve nothing. But if they decided to turn to Washington, then they could achieve through diplomacy their objectives of territorial reacquisition of territory they'd lost to Israel. That was his calculation. So he had to block the Soviets at every opportunity, show the Arabs that they weren't going to win, particularly in the 1973 war, and that they would eventually turn to him. And that's exactly what Sadat did. But along the way, he discovered that the Russians were pushovers. In 1970, the Soviets backed a move by Syrian army into Jordan as part of an effort to support the PLO's attempt to overthrow the king of Jordan. And Kissinger, first of all, went to Israel and got the Israelis to mobilize on the Golan Heights and in the Jordan Valley. And then sent 2 carrier battle groups into the eastern Mediterranean. And the Soviets backed down, told the Syrians to pull out. I mean, the king of Jordan managed to hold off the Syrians, but nevertheless, the Soviets backed down within 24, 48 hours. During the war, Kissinger faced a situation, I won't go through the whole explanation of what happened, but basically the Russians threatened to intervene militarily to save the Egyptian Third Army. And Kissinger and Schlesinger, the defense secretary, and Al Haig, who was then chief of staff, ordered a DEFCON 3 nuclear alert, sent 3 carrier battle groups into the eastern Mediterranean, mobilised the 82nd Airborne and half of the troops in Europe, and the Soviet Union backed down within 24 hours. And when I asked him about that in the context of Putin threatening nuclear weapons, no, he said to me, well, in those days we were made of tougher stuff. By the way, he did that while Nixon was drunk and in bed, asleep, and they didn't consult with him when they put all of American forces on a DEFCON 3 nuclear alert.
And was it in that occasion that Brezhnev was also on a bender?
Exactly. Yeah. Brezhnev was out of it too. So we had the 2 world leaders drunken in bed while this confrontation is going on. And you're afraid of Putin, you know. So anyway,
that is
I think we should be afraid, maybe.
Yeah, that is a motif, though, or a theme that runs throughout the whole book is when you were interviewing Kissinger, well, we were just a lot tougher in those days. You guys are all pushovers. And I think at one point he takes a swipe at Obama, too, and says, oh, well, this isn't the Obama administration we're talking about.
Yeah. Just last point on this. When he engages in the diplomacy that I described, and he's shuttling back and forth between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria, the Soviets are just bystanders. This is their positions of influence in the region, and they simply stand by, hoping to gain some credit from the deals that he does. And yet their clients are only interested in working with the United States, as he predicted, and couldn't give a damn about the Soviet Union. And so as a result, he was able to essentially sideline them completely from the Middle East.
The result, though, is sort of the poison chalice, if you will, of American policy in the Middle East, which is to say the Arabs were all convinced that only we could bring Israel to the table and make real concessions. And at the end of the day, we can't. We couldn't. And, Kissinger tried it once, and even he sort of backed away when he has the reassessment in 74, 75.
But he succeeded after that.
Yeah.
He succeeded where in a confrontation with Israel, in which he withheld arms to Israel for 4 months. We couldn't get away with it today for 4 seconds, I think, before there'd be a furor on Capitol Hill, and that is part of the story. Is that Kissinger understood that his legitimizing mechanism had to have a territorial component. There had to be Israeli withdrawals in tranches that Israel could stomach politically. But that was the critical element. And you're quite right. We lost the art of delivering Israel.
Yeah.
That I detail in the book how he did it, partly through pressure, but mostly through his argument and his working with Israel to support them as they gave up the territory and reward them when they gave up the territory.
To everyone who hasn't read the book, the descriptions of how Kissinger manages the relationship with Israel and cajoling, threatening, hugging, I'm 100% with you, and then calling up the Department of Defense, telling them to stonewall these. I mean, I have to say, I read it, and you mentioned Aida. There's an opera here. There is absolutely an opera here. And,
or at least a Netflix series.
Yeah. Well, in your interest, yes, I think you probably do a lot better with that. And I wasn't going to bring this up right now, but the portrait, you forced me into it. The portrait of his relationship with Golda Meir, it's a Netflix series all its own. I mean, it's all there. I wouldn't wish that relationship on anyone with their mother. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's completely out of control.
Yes, well, Golda was a formidable character, and she was not averse to playing on Kissinger's sense of Jewish guilt, and she treated him, as he says, like the wayward nephew. And yet, he would stand up to her and do battle with her. But on other occasions, and many of you know Henry Kissinger, of course, he's been very involved with the American Academy. He is basically a sentimentalist at heart, notwithstanding all the other things. And so I tell the story of he negotiates a ceasefire agreement in the 73 war in Moscow with Brezhnev. And Brezhnev says to him, do we need to go back to the Israelis and the Egyptians and get their approval for this? And Kissinger says, no, there's no need for that. We'll just go straight to the Security Council. That was Kissinger's notion of the hierarchy in world affairs. The superpowers decided these things. They didn't need to consult with their clients. But then he goes to Israel and meets with Golda Meir. And he knows that he has screwed her because he had promised her before he went to Moscow that they would have at least 2 days to finish the job. And suddenly they're faced with a fait accompli of a Security Council resolution, which the Israelis accept. But he expects them to be very upset with him. He expects Golda to give him a head scrubbing. And instead, she thanks him for all that he did to support Israel during the war with the arms supplies. And his heart clearly goes out to her. And so he responds by telling her, it'll take a while for the ceasefire to take hold. I'm flying back. It'll take me a while to get back to Washington. You can have 2 more days to continue the fighting. After he's already agreed with Brezhnev on the ceasefire, and it's already gone through the Security Council, and the time has been set for this. And he says it not once but 3 times in different forums that in these meetings he's having with Dayan and with the generals. And he asks the generals, what would you do if you had more time? And they show him how they would cut off the Egyptian Third Army. He gets home from this trip and lo and behold discovers that the Israelis have cut off the Egyptian Third Army. And that's what occasioned the threat of intervention from the Soviets that led to nuclear alert. And I was trying to figure out, why would he do that? He didn't need to. The Israelis had accepted the ceasefire. They were unhappy. But here it was, this his sense of guilt that he had screwed his Jewish aunt, that he tells them something that he should have never done, to basically encourage them. When I asked him about it, he said, they were in bad shape. They were emotionally in a very bad shape. I felt that I had to do something for them.
So it raises the really fascinating question about the role that his Jewish identity plays in all this. Now, I'm just a few years younger than you, Martin, and I was growing up in in southern New England in a very Jewish milieu, and people did not trust Henry Kissinger. They did not think he had Israel's back in those days, and it was incredibly controversial. And the picture that you paint of him is completely at odds with what the public perception was.
Yeah, I think that's true. To this day, he's a controversial figure in the American Jewish community, and certainly in Israel. And it's a combination of this idea that he held up arms to Israel when they needed it most during the 1973 war. There's actually an interesting analogy with the situation today in the Ukraine, where Zelensky keeps on calling for more arms. The Israelis were calling for more arms, calling for arms, and Kissinger was slow to respond. Sound familiar? And he was slow to respond. First of all, because he thought the Israelis would deal with the Egyptians and the Syrians in short order. That was the assumption, that the Israelis had so much military capability that if the Arabs dared to go to war, it'd be over in a few days, just like the Six-Day War. And that's what the Israelis believed too, so it's not unreasonable for him to believe that. They didn't tell him how dire their situation was for 4 days. They kept it from him. So he can't be blamed for those 4 days. But after they revealed how bad their situation was, he tried to deal with it with commercial aircraft. Not, as in this case, because he feared that the Soviets would object. Actually, interestingly, the Soviets never objected when they launched a massive resupply effort under Nixon's orders. The Soviets, of course, were resupplying the Egyptians and Syrians, but they never objected and never tried to interfere with the American arms supplies to the Israelis. So, anyway, the point is that he was at first careful about how he responded. And his concern at the time was that if they did an overt, massive resupply effort, the Arabs would slap an embargo, oil embargo, on the West. And sure enough, as soon as they launched the massive resupply effort, that's exactly what the Arabs did. And that, together with raising the price of oil, plunged the world economy into a recession, and the United States economy into a recession. So it wasn't an unreasonable concern. Again, it's kind of déjà vu about it. But he did. But the bottom line is that he was wholeheartedly behind the resupply effort because he needed Israeli counteroffensives to put pressure on the Arabs to agree to a ceasefire, which was the essence of his diplomatic game, to start his diplomatic game. And so he gets a bum rap for that one. But he also is in Israel, has a bad reputation because he pressured Israel to give up territory. And by getting Israel to give up territory, He laid the foundations for taking Egypt out of the conflict with Israel and the foundations for peace between Israel and Egypt. The Israelis actually owe him a great debt of gratitude for convincing them, their leaders, to give up territory.
It does seem that sometimes his strategy was not apparent to everyone.
No, and that's partly because Henry is the master of the game. He's also the master of obfuscation. Well, he didn't want to let on what he was up to. And the reason for that was that here he faced a president who doubted his intentions, didn't think he was loyal to the United States. And he faced a State Department that was hostile to the idea that he should protect Israel by these smaller territorial things, or reward Israel with these massive arms supplies when Israel gave up territory. So, the story that I tell is of a Kissinger who's actually, at every point along the way, trying to support Israel, articulate a peace process that will work to Israel's benefit, strengthen Israel with massive arms supplies. And so that is the ultimate irony, that he doesn't get any credit for it.
You talk about obfuscation. One of the things that most impresses me in your depiction of him is, first of all, his unbelievable talent for improvising. He's dealt one unexpected set of developments after another, and he seems to be so unbelievably quick to react. More often than not, and get it right. But the other thing is, obfuscation may be a Baudelarization or even a euphemism. There's that great 16th century saying, an ambassador, and we might substitute a diplomat, is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. And Kissinger's ability to just invent these amazing stories to all of his interlocutors is dazzling. I mean, it was, I don't think any of us normal people can improvise on our. I mean, I've known some really impressive, and we know some in common, but we don't talk about them. But it's extraordinary. It's just dazzling.
So that's why I titled the book "Master of the Game."
Yeah.
He actually didn't like the couple of chapters that I gave him to read in draft. He called Gail and said he never wanted to talk to me again. And when he finally calmed down, about 2 months later, and told me what he objected to, it was precisely this, that he objected to the fact that I made him look manipulative. And of course, it's all there in the documentations, exactly as you describe it. He was a master of saying different things to different audiences. And the great irony of this was that the Israelis and the Arabs knew exactly what he was up to. Mm-hmm. It was really a question of who was zooming who in this. The Israelis had a spy in Sadat's inner office, and it's unclear to this day whether Sadat knew it, that is to say, whether this guy was a counter spy or he didn't know it. But in any case, this guy was telling Golda what Kissinger was saying to Sadat. And so she knew that he was playing this double game. And the Egyptian, Sadat, would conspire with Sadat. So he understood, with Kissinger, he understood exactly what Kissinger was up to. So in the end, Kissinger spent an incredible amount of effort playing this game, but they actually were onto him, and it's unclear as to whether they were manipulating him more than he was manipulating them. But it's an amazing game. Just to end the story on him, I said to him, finally, when he finished complaining about how bad the book made him look, I said to him, Henry, I think you'll like the title. And he said, what's that? Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. And there's this long pause. Finally he says, well, I can't argue with that.
Well, I could ask a million more questions, but I'm honor-bound to open it up to others. So, questions, please. Yes, right over here. Boris. Wait for the mic, otherwise our viewers won't hear you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Really enjoyed your presentation. I have not read the book, but the question that comes to mind is, your starting point is Kissinger's dissertation, Castlereagh and Metternich, and they create this 100-year peace order. What Kissinger does in the Middle East, by contrast, is he creates, as Dan pointed out, a kind of Pax Americana, which puts America at the center of this. And then go on a few decades, and the George W. Bush administration tops that by invading Iraq and upsetting a balance that exists in the region. And so America is in charge of everything. But then the world continues to evolve, and China becomes an issue, and America decides that it can no longer be quite as invested in the Middle East. So in a sense, is it not Kissinger who has sort of created an order in the Middle East that, in a sense, already includes the seeds of its own demise, if you like?
Yes, and it's almost as if he predicted it. In his great concern about the enthusiasms of leaders, particularly American leaders, and he writes about this in his other book, Diplomacy. The very thing that Bill Clinton did, as I described, at Camp David, and George W. Bush did in Iraq, was the very thing he warned against. This kind of overreaching in order to achieve peace or to achieve democracy. Make the world over in America's image was something that he was absolutely opposed to. And understood that America with its great power and American leaders with their sense of divine providence and obligation were really prone to this kind of overreaching that in the end led to the demise. If Kissinger's counsel had been followed, I dare say we'd still have a Pax Americana in the Middle East today. Who can tell? It's counterfactual. But the two things went hand in hand. When we overreached in the peace process, it exploded in our face, we no longer had that legitimizing mechanism that Kissinger had designed. And we couldn't deliver. And that affected our standing in the Middle East much more than I think we understood at the time. And then, to completely ignore the balance of power in the Gulf, open the doors of Babylon to the Iranians, was, anti-Kissingerian in every respect. So the peace that he secured through his diplomacy lasted for about 40 years until it didn't. So that wasn't 100 years, but it wasn't bad. And while it lasted, more or less, the United States was in a strong position in the region, and we managed to protect our interests fairly well until it all came apart.
So let me follow up on that. The book, pretty much endorses Kissinger's approach of step-by-step diplomacy. But there's also a tension there, because I think that you think, or at least when I read it, I thought that Kissinger blew it with Jordan, and they should have gone for something ambitious there, and there wouldn't be 435,000 settlers, now, and the PLO would never have become the authorized spokes organization for the Palestinians. I mean, you could endorse a view that says, yeah, maybe most of the time you want to be gradual, but there may also be those moments.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. That there are times when it's appropriate. Jimmy Carter went for it. Kissinger would not have gone for it.
Yeah.
And he got the peace that's lasted 40 years. And so, yes, absolutely. There's the danger of underreaching. That's what Kissinger's conservatism and incrementalism is. That's the downside of his approach. Yeah. You know, if you look at we who came after Kissinger, we knew not Kissinger. Part of the reason we knew not Kissinger is who goes and reads A World Restored? You know, I mean, you won't find it in his 4,000-page memoirs. He doesn't explain it. He was pursuing peace. And so...
people are also daunted by the length.
Yes.
But 1,000 pages or something?
You know, my point is that we... And I say this about me in particular, because I'm haunted by this as I was writing this book, thinking back. When I sat down with Bill Clinton, the first meeting we had about what we were going to do in the Middle East after he became president, I was his Middle East advisor in the National Security Council, I said to him, look, Mr. President, if you put your mind to it, the stars are all aligned for you to achieve 4 peace agreements in your first term in office, and we can end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he said to me, I want to do that. And we were off. And, you know, Oslo Accords suddenly came through the doors. We weren't even pursuing it. We were pursuing a peace between Israel and Syria that we basically had in our pockets. And then came the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, and we really thought that we were on. I used to say to him each time, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. And I knew not Kissinger.
Yeah.
I knew not the need for a sense of caution, the fragility of the process and the way in which the United States could actually break it while trying to do good.
You'll remember that Bill Clinton was an inveterate player of the card game Hearts. And the ultimate move in that is called Shoot the Moon. And that was what he loved to do. Yeah. And that's the temptation of American presidents. Questions? Jeremy, I brought him here just for you.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much.
Thanks. That puts no pressure on my question at all. It seems to me that what you're describing in other places has been called sort of solutionism, this sort of idea that what you're really trying to do is find an ultimate solution. And from my experience, that is very much the sort of culture of American diplomacy. I think your last boss, John Kerry, was kind of an agreement-seeking missile. He didn't really see anything to either side. So he was maybe an extreme example, but it's pretty common actually. And I think, you know, if you, as the Middle East advisor, if you had in your first meeting with Bill Clinton said, well, you know, there's not really that much we can achieve here. Maybe we should do something incrementally. You probably wouldn't have been the Middle East advisor anymore. So it seems to me that there's something very deep in the culture about not knowing Kissinger. And I'm wondering if, from your experience, if you can tell us where you think this comes from. Why is it that this is so much a part of American diplomatic culture?
Yeah. Well, I think you know the answer too, but I
want to hear from you.
Yeah. Look, it stems in large part from the sense of immense power that the United States has, consciousness of our immense power, the leader of the free world. as presidents keep on describing themselves as. And the sense of obligation that American leaders take upon themselves to make the world over as a more peaceful place. Peaceful, not orderly. Order is not something that is the stuff of greatness in the minds of American leaders. So that's the first point. The second is just this American can-do engineering belief that every problem has a solution. And all you've got to do is figure out what it is, and then everybody's going to go along with it. And that is the combination of innocence and ignorance that informs a lot of American foreign policy. And if I sound overcritical, I don't mean to be, because there's something wonderful about it. I chose to be an American because of its great generosity of spirit. But the downside is this innocence and arrogance, naivety and arrogance, which trips us up so often. And I think it is bred in the bone. It's in our DNA. And you're right. If I had it over again, I probably would have said something similar to Clinton. But at Camp David, if I'd had the opportunity, I would have said, "Do not do this." I didn't actually have that opportunity. I was ambassador in Israel, not in Washington at the time.
Surely it also has something to do with the fact that presidents have to run for office every 4 years, and they can't just say,
yes.
"Well, I didn't do anything."
I maintained the order.
There was
maintained the balance of power.
There's that old joke at the State Department that the mandarins would say to you, "Don't just do something, stand there." We were talking about Iraq. It's amazing, because that really was America's Jacobin moment. We were going to reinvent the world. And it came after our Congress of Vienna moment in the mid-'70s. The other part of Kissinger's diplomacy that was very difficult for America was his belief that you could always create a condominium. You would find the two big powers in an area, whether it was the U.S. and Russia or Israel and Egypt, and they would run everything together. And that also is kind of at odds with democracies in which, you have fragile coalitions and different tensions within countries, things like that.
Yes, but I think that it's the problem is more that Kissinger had a hierarchical view of international affairs, in which the superpowers, like the great powers of yore, ran the world. And he did not allow for the role of small states or the objections of small states, let alone non-state actors. Non-state actors did not exist for him. So the PLO was a nuisance factor, because they were trying to overthrow the King of Jordan. They were killing American diplomats. They were blowing up American planes. So he opened a dialogue with the PLO, actually, which his successors wouldn't do, but he did. But it was all done by the CIA, and it was all covert. But it was just to keep them quiet. And it was the same with Jordan. The reason why he didn't pursue an Israeli-Jordanian agreement was because Jordan was a small power. And while he liked the king, he didn't value the king. The game for him was to get Egypt, the militarily most powerful, largest Arab state, out of the conflict, because that would stabilize the order. And he needed Syria to legitimize Egypt ending its conflict with Israel. And as for the rest, they'd have to make do with the order such as it was. And if they disrupted it, then the regional powers who had a stake in maintaining the order would basically control it.
So we have a question now from the Council on Foreign Relations. Senior Fellow Ben Steele will ask Distinguished Fellow Martin Indyk an intramural face-off. Yeah.
Martin, you probably knew that some variation of this question was coming, but if Henry Kissinger were a younger man today, would he like to be Secretary of State during this Ukraine war? What would he do, and would it be the right approach?
Thank you, Ben. I thought that would be the first question, because on my talks around the country, as I've been out there promoting this book, it's the first question I get every time. And so eventually I decided I would call up the good Dr. Kissinger and ask him, so I've got to at least have some better answer. It's not clear to me that he hankers after the job anymore. He's about to turn 99, so I think his ambitions have been tempered. He does like to advise governments, and that's why he's always very careful not to criticise. And in case you haven't noticed, he hasn't written anything about the crisis. That's partly because he's finishing a book. This is his second book this year, at the age of 99. And this book will be an interesting one, because it's a book about the great statesmen that he's known, from Nixon to Thatcher to de Gaulle to Konrad Adenauer. And after he read my book, he called me up and said he was going to add Sadat to it as well. But it's a kind of pantheon of great statesmen. So he's been preoccupied with that. But we did talk about it. We had a couple of occasions to talk about it. And he's told me that he's actually going to write something next week. So we have to wait for that. But in the meantime, a little preview, if you like. He wrote in 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea, about Ukraine. And he wrote then that Ukraine should be a neutral state, a buffer between East and West, between NATO and Russia, and a bridge. He thought then, as he thinks now, that Ukraine, if it wants, should be part of the EU, but should not be part of NATO. And he feels that NATO should have been taken off the table before Putin invaded. Whether that would have made any difference, he's not clear, but he thinks that should have been done. And he applauds Zelensky's subsequent statements during the war, in which he talks about a neutralised Ukraine. So that's what he thinks should be the ultimate outcome. He is, to my surprise, not opposed to the idea of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I would have expected that he would see that as making it more difficult to re-establish a stable order, which is what he's all about. But he thinks that is somewhat inevitable, and he's not opposed to it. And he also feels essentially that Putin has lost this war, that the greater threat is not to Ukraine's independence, but rather Russia's territorial integrity, which is interesting, that he foresees a potential for the loss of central authority in Russia and the disintegration of the Russian state, which is interesting. And so, he's not worried about Ukraine's security in the long term. He says, the Russians can't defeat one country. How are they going to defeat 30 countries in NATO. He sees this in very clear kind of power terms, as you would expect from him, and sees the Russians as having revealed their fundamental weakness.
Last question. Since I don't see anyone putting up their hand, I'll ask it. You wrote...
Somebody there.
Oh, how could I not let Lawrence? Then I'll just ask mine afterward. Yeah.
Actually, this is just a clarification question. In your conversation with Dan, when you were first talking about the way Kissinger dealt with Jordan, you seemed to suggest that this was part of his measured, cautious approach, and you even described it as underreaching. And then you described it later as actually Kissinger really not paying attention to Jordan, that Jordan was not a key enough player. So it really wasn't a matter of underreaching as much as him just having a worldview in which this wasn't all that important. So I was just wondering if you might be able to clarify a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good point, and there is a tension between the two things that I was saying. I think the second thing is the heart of the matter when you look at the story of what happened. He had negotiated an agreement between Israel and Egypt, an agreement between Israel and Syria. And the question then was, what's next? And Sadat was anxious to have another agreement and more return of territory to Egypt. And so Sadat was pressing him. And Rabin, who had just become prime minister and was much weaker than Golda Meir at that time, and dependent on the National Religious Party, which was absolutely opposed to any territorial concession in the West Bank. So Rabin also wanted to do an Egyptian deal rather than a Jordanian deal. So that was the situation in which he had to decide which way to go. But his underreaching was in that he could have, at that moment, pursued both an Israeli-Egyptian negotiation and an Israeli-Jordanian negotiation. That's what lesser mortals like Bill Clinton did at the beginning of the peace process that I was involved in. We had an Israeli-Syrian track and an Israeli-Palestinian track, Israeli-Jordanian track. And we were pursuing them all at the same time and taking advantage of where we could, where one moved faster than the other, repress the other to move as well. And Rabin, the same Rabin, was cooperating with us in that because he too saw the advantage of playing one track off against the other. And it's not as if Kissinger wasn't aware of the option. His aides, Harold Saunders in particular, made the argument to him that he should do both at the same time. But he rejected it. And that's where I say he underreached. Because he, not that he in the end could have had two agreements, but at least, he could have gained diplomatically from trying, and he wasn't prepared to do it. He was not, he repeatedly says to the Israelis, you should make a deal with the Jordanians. If you don't do it, the PLO will take over. So it's in your interest to do it, but I'm not going to press you. I'm not going to get involved in it. And that was the other side of it, was this sense that it wasn't important enough for him.
We are past time, and I'm still going to ask you one last question while I've got you here. You wrote a couple of years ago in the Wall Street Journal that that Middle East diplomacy, or trying to reshape the Middle East, and maybe the Middle East peace process in particular, I know you'll correct me on this, is no longer worth the candle, that it's just not possible to get the kind of results we want in the world we live in. How do you feel now?
First of all, I want to say something that I should have said at the outset, which is thank you to you, Daniel, for having me, hosting me, and for this great opportunity, and for your leadership of the American Academy. So I'm grateful to you for all those things. I became, as a result of this journey of writing this book, I became a convert to incrementalism. But part of the reason for that is that it isn't possible now. Everybody sees now that it isn't possible to jump from where we are in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians to a final status agreement, a negotiation that I was involved in for so many years in previous administrations. And so it's kind of accepted now that we can't get there from here. And so we don't have an alternative but to take an incremental approach. And the Israeli government, which is a strange combination of left and right-wing parties that don't agree on what the outcome should be when it comes to the Palestinians, is prepared to take steps. They're economic steps. I think that the United States could engage in this process in a way that added what Kissinger would have added, which is a territorial component, which is elements of sovereignty for the Palestinians that would give them a state in the making. These are his words, not mine. And that therefore, it makes sense to be less ambitious and to encourage an incremental approach. But in terms of the broader question, yes, America has other priorities now. And even though this article that you're referring to that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal didn't have my headline. They
never do.
No, they never do. The headline was "The Middle East isn't worth it anymore," which is not my position. My position is that the importance of the Middle East is necessarily reduced as we have to face a rising China and an aggressive revisionist Russia. But that just means we have to find a way, in Kissingerian terms, to stabilize the order in the Middle East so that we can deal with these other more pressing challenges. And the interesting thing, and I would have never predicted it, is that as the powers in the region feel that we're turning our backs on them, they are, in surprising ways, stepping up and acting responsibly for once. Not all of them. But I don't know whether you've noticed that the Middle East is much quieter today than it's been for a hell of a long time. And I believe that is partly because they have to fill the vacuum. They have to act responsibly. And as they do that, it gives us a different kind of role, where we, instead of being the dominant power ruling the Pax Americana, we can play a supportive role as Israel and the Sunni Arab states, fearing an Iran that seeks dominance in the region, hegemony in the region, and is causing subversion across the Arab world and on Israel's borders, that they're coming together to take responsibility for stabilizing the order. And amazingly, Egypt and Jordan are engaging in Gaza and the West Bank in a way that they wouldn't do for the last 25 years. And that's very important in terms of creating a better environment for trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because they can act as anchors and custodians for the Palestinians as they build their institutions of state. But at the same time, we've got all sorts of other things going on. The Saudis finally are acting in a way to try to help ameliorate the conflict in Yemen rather than exacerbating it. So I think it's possible to create a more stable order in the region, ironically, by the United States doing less rather than more.
Benign neglect.
No, not neglect. Benign engagement.
Benign engagement, okay. And on
in a supportive role.
Thank you very much, Martin Indyk, for fascinating reading.